ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Welcome to our Lunch and Learn workshop. It is, again, I don't know what it is now, but we started this series, and again, on the back of some feedback from a lot of the firms that wanted to know more, and I suppose coming off the back of what we've come off the last 2.5 years with COVID, and we're seeing a lot of different businesses in different industries doing things a bit hard. So like we mentioned before, if there is the ability to commence a conversation sooner and have us talk about or share certain things with your clients, I think that's the key, and that's why we want to do these. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Paul Jantz. So we're here on behalf of Hall Chadwick and Professional Partners Education, which is the division that I run, bringing you all sorts of different educational content. That's what we do at PPE. Big shout out to Danielle Morrison. I know Danny, I'm not sure if she's online. She might be online. You've been invited on behalf of Danny to join us today. Just to, again, these sort of, while we've been running our lunches in Melbourne, Brisbane, Sydney, this is a next little layer of extension to you and your team. I think it's important, certainly for your team, from a CPD point of view as well, to try and engage as many team members as you can. If you haven't engaged your team, that's okay as well, because all of these get uploaded to our, what we call our PPE TV Plus. So our PPE TV Plus channel is our YouTube channel. So all this content gets uploaded, including all of the previous and it's all free content for you and your team members if you've missed last month, so which was about how a voluntary administration can save your client's business and you can retain your client. So we're going to do a quick recap. We're going to talk about the VA process, which is going to be fairly important. We'll talk about then if there's corporate structures, director obligations, claims that may arise from of company arrangement. And then we'll also share, you know, this is the great thing about day in, day out, I suppose. They're going to share some of the successes as well from a voluntary administration perspective. So we'll go for about 30 minutes. You've got your chat bar down below. So if you've got any questions, I'll moderate any questions you want to throw out to Aaron or to Rich. And let's introduce our guests. So I think the best thing is, I know we had Cam Shaw from our Perth office join us last month. So this month we've got Aaron Dominish. Is that how I say that, Aaron?
Dominish, Paul. Thank you. It's pretty good. Sorry, pretty good effort.
Close, but no cigar.
You got it.
And we've also got one of our most experienced partners here from Hall Chadwick as well. We've got Richard Croaker joining us. Rich, how are you?
Good, thanks, Paul. Very well indeed.
You can all hear us quite well, which is the main thing. What have we got? Our numbers are up. We've got people chatting. A bit choppy at your end. Hopefully the old Wi-Fi sticks with us. So hopefully it's okay. Our topic for today. So what we might do is do a bit of a recap. Let's go back. We covered sort of voluntary administration, the process. Aaron, maybe if you don't mind doing a bit of a recap. I know Cam did it last month, but do you mind taking us through a bit of a recap to some of the things we covered last month?
Yeah, sure can, Paul. I suppose I've previously sat down with a director and a CFO on the back of a successful voluntary administration. And he basically called that a bit of a miracle. So to flip that back to the start, that was a mid-tier construction company, a family business, about 70 employees or so. It had 9 projects ongoing at the start. So pretty large scale voluntary administration. And it was a great outcome because we actually got a lot of the progress claims from pre-appointment paid to the subbies, and that business came out the other side and continued rolling through and has now been trading for another 4 years. So that's probably an example of a successful voluntary administration. And as Cam sort of touched on a couple of weeks back, A voluntary administration is basically a process of implementing a 4 to 5 week debt moratorium. And that allows a bit of time to deal with creditors. And a lot of the time that's to sit down with your large secured creditors, whether that's a bank or a private lender, to sort of discuss what the future of the company is and gauge their level of support. The other thing it does is it also provides protection for ongoing trade and suppliers. So there's a personal liability aspect there for the administrator, which means that if suppliers are working with the company during the voluntary administration process, they're covered for their costs and whatnot, which really sort of leads to that entrepreneurial or that continuation style of business. And I suppose the final thing that we always talk about in a voluntary administration is the creditors vote at the end of that 4 to 5 week period. And that's basically where creditors will choose from 3 options. And that's either to wind the company up, to execute a deed of company arrangement. I'm sure we'll touch on deeds of company arrangement a bit later on, or to hand the company back to the directors. So that's a very brief overview of the process, but the administrator also does a lot of other things in that 4 to 5 week timeframe. So they'll take control of the company's assets, which includes the business. They may continue to trade, as I've said, and that there's protections in place and mechanisms in place to protect suppliers in that situation. They also go back and investigate the company's historical affairs. So what led to this point, what the company has done in the past, who the directors were, all things like that. The administrator also reports to the ASIC in terms of their finding on those affairs. They also work with potentially the director or a third party to formulate that deed of company arrangement proposal. And that's very, very broad. And a lot of the time will require the assistance of their trusted external advisor, the accountant.
Yes.
And finally prepares a report to creditors, which sets out what they have, what the administrator has investigated, what they expect or what they've found, and what they expect the outcome might be from those 3 scenarios. So I think that's a bit of a brief overview.
Well, I think the great part was, and I think, you know, and again, thank you to all of you that have joined us, because the firms that have joined us over the last few months as well, it's a funny thing, and probably Rich can talk about this a bit as well, where they've reached out to us to they've started to have that conversation, and we talk about those early conversations and those early starters. They've started to reach out to their clients and then reach back out to us to say, sort of what's involved, that early stage, what happens with a client prior to that. Rich, is that something even you may wish to touch on?
Yeah, Paul, it's a very good point that, you know, just going into a voluntary administration or any form of insolvency will always have some preparatory work going on behind the scenes before the actual appointment is made. And that can be for a number of reasons. For example, in Queensland, we have the QBCC, and Aaron was speaking about his very successful voluntary administration in the construction industry in WA. We've got a set of rules here in Queensland that actually change the dynamic about how we deal with a construction company compared to Western Australia, for example. And actually, I just had a look through the list of people who are here, and I'm actually pleased to, if I could give a quick shout out to Adele Stridham, who's joined us been with us a number of times. She's based on the Sunshine Coast. But the QBCC have a set of rules here that make it a lot more difficult for construction companies to get through voluntary administration. Having said that, I'm actually working with a company here in Queensland right now as to how we deal with that. But the other thing about it is it's also a bit of horses for courses. So voluntary administration is really better I don't want to say better suited to larger companies, but typically you might see a larger company benefiting more out of voluntary administration, leading to a deed of company arrangement than perhaps smaller companies might be. And interestingly, as we came through the COVID period, there was an introduction of a simplified insolvency process. And a lot of that pre-work is talking to the accountants, but at our level, talking to the accountants about what the alternatives might be, what's the best thing to be able to use. And if I could also point out that our also in this webinar, one of our guests is the National Professional Standards Manager for Hall Chadwick, who's based in Adelaide, who's actually joined us, and he's been quite a champion of the simplified process. And as and that's probably a discussion for a separate webinar, Paul. Let's not go into that here now. But the point of it is that the lead up time is very important. Working with the accountant so that the accountant not only understands how it's going to work, but can converse with his client to make sure that the client understands it. And moving into a very uncertain time, what the outcomes can be and what they're likely to be is very important.
It's probably a really good point that you raised there, Rich. But that early engagement can also lead to, I suppose, a circumstance where an appropriate professional can come in and potentially assist with a solvent restructure if it's just a potential external hiccup that's a one-off and a temporary cash flow issue. Engaging with qualified and well-experienced professionals can lead to a restructure and potentially avoid that formal process, which is obviously beneficial for the trusted advisor and for the company as well sometimes.
So let's delve a little bit deeper into, let's say, things that may arise if things go wrong. Let's talk about corporate structures. I mentioned director obligations before, and any claims that. Can you guys maybe go into a little bit more detail about if things go wrong, what happens in those three key areas? And then we'll talk about Division 7A loans as well.
Yeah, sure can. I suppose from a structure perspective, if everything was to go wrong and a company was to be wound up, you potentially run the risk if our wider group is structured in a way that there can be sort of a flow-on effect of the insolvency. Maybe a trading entity then leads to the insolvency of a parent entity, which creates flow-on effects for maybe other trading arms or other divisions of the group. And in those circumstances, you potentially run the risk of the entire group falling over due to a external shock in one operating division. So that's a structure thing, and obviously I'm sure all of our trusted advisors sitting down with their clients as they come onto their books and working through those sorts of things and discussing how their corporate structures are established and whatnot. Probably turning to directors' obligations. Rich, you've probably got some comments around that.
Yeah. So just on the point of the impact upon the broader structures, obviously probably the worst outcome for a director and shareholder is that if the whole thing goes pear-shaped, that they would end up bankrupt and lose personal assets. But as Aaron just mentioned, there are also offences under the Corporations Act beyond insolvent trading, but director transactions can lead to civil impacts, civil penalties, recovery effects, and potentially criminal offences as well. But I think that comes back to working it out with the advisor before pressing the button on whatever insolvency vehicle you're going to use, is to work through what the impacts could be. And Paul, you just mentioned about Division 7A. One of the obligations of an administrator and a liquidator is to look at what the recoverability of those loans. And one of the things that happens in a company that's losing money is there's a temptation to make the profits look better by taking money away from wages and salaries and placing them onto director loans. Lenders are pretty smart about that. They see what's going on, but nevertheless, there's a temptation to do that. And unfortunately, what happens when the company ultimately fails, if that's the outcome, that the liquidator well, typically a liquidator has to go back and recover those loans, and that in itself can have a catastrophic effect on the personal finances of the director and the family. And then there's the other thing about trusts. I'm surprised and amazed that in some cases I've actually seen trading trusts where the trustee is actually an individual as opposed to a corporate. And I can't think of a reason why you would have a trading trust with an individual as a trustee. I've certainly seen it in some very old trusts, but in the modern times, we need to be looking at our deeds and making sure that they are properly structured, not only in terms of who is the trustee, but also who is the appointor. Is the appointor role correctly documented in the deed? What is the role of the trustee? Who are the beneficiaries? Because that can have an impact on ultimate outcomes as well. So my point is that it's not just the corporate structure when you're talking about voluntary administration or liquidation. It's actually the broader structures as well. And Aaron, if I could just pick one that we're looking at the moment, is the potential liability of a holding company or a parent company relating to the liabilities of a subsidiary in the event of insolvency, and that's going to have an impact on a report that Aaron's doing at the moment. And these are important things that you need to be looking at as an advisor when you're thinking about insolvency.
Yeah, because you would think that, given my limited, I know you guys are the experts here, but given the most there's some wider implications there, isn't it? Especially if you're not getting in early to look at all of those different structures and where it can affect the holding companies, as you just mentioned, right down.
Yeah.
You go ahead. Yeah, that trickle down effect can be obviously very detrimental for the group, and as Richard says, the directors and shareholders potentially as well. Probably again goes to that point about early engagement, and there was some legislative reform back in 2017 which introduced something called safe harbour, and safe harbour is probably a topic for a later lunch and learn, Paul, about engaging with an appropriately qualified professional to put in place a plan that is likely to lead to a better outcome than an immediate insolvency appointment.
Right. Okay. Yeah,
actually,
good.
on that point, Paul, I think that practitioners have underutilised the safe harbour provisions. I actually see it as an insurance policy, if you call it that. It's just the chance to be able to look at the circumstances around a company and just take some time out to be able to resolve it with some protection, some protection from the law against insolvent trading during that period. The other thing, while we're just talking about this, and it struck me as Aaron mentioned it, is the risk of DPN on the broader structures of the individual. So as you know, we now have a very wide catchment for director penalties. It's not just PAYG, but in addition to that, we also have the lockdown penalties, the lockdown DPN as well. And if a company goes into liquidation, a tax is unpaid, a lockdown penalty, a lockdown DPN exists, well, as sure as night follows day, eventually the tax office is going to catch up with that director to say, well, pay up the money. And that in itself could have catastrophic consequences to the individual director if it's not dealt with.
And that probably compounds on the comments around a Div 7A as well, Richard. Obviously, in circumstances where the company is wound up and liquidated, the liquidator might come knocking as well to recover some of these Division 7A loans that might be outstanding for 5-6 years potentially, and still have that balance there. So that can obviously be a large personal liability that the liquidator's coming after, which is then compounded by a potential tax debt that's subject to a DPN.
And does that necessarily, I don't know, there's some entrepreneurs that believe sometimes that they're protected because they don't own assets in their own name. How deep do they dig?
That's an interesting point. A lot of the time, well, when you say the directors, for example, may not own the assets personally, let's look at a bankruptcy scenario. There's potentials and provisions under the Bankruptcy Act where a bankruptcy trustee can go and bust through trusts and get into some assets that may be squared away in a corporate structure or a trust structure to recover money for the creditors. And one of those creditors may be the liquidator for potentially an insolvent trading claim or potentially Div 7A loans. So it's something to be very wary of. And obviously that would be a worst case scenario where the company and the director are completely wiped out by an insolvency event.
Which is exactly what we're trying to highlight, I suppose, here is not that you want it to go down that road, but it is important to look at everything where something could potentially go wrong from that bankruptcy side, that it can go down to that level. So I suppose, we started this talking about the proactive approach, to call it the early approach, if that's what you want to call it. That's what it's about, isn't it? So if we touch on that for a second in terms of the process and who they should be looking to engage with early, you guys maybe share again some key things around what firms can start doing.
I reckon a good place to start there is to actually talk through what happens as soon as you sign on the dotted line for a voluntary administration, all the way through to a deed of company arrangement. I know Aaron's had a lot of experience in that. And maybe Aaron, if you were just to talk through those steps so that you can that our listeners can understand what those steps are and what they mean for the company and the director.
Yeah, sure can. So it probably goes back to some of my earlier comments where we breezed across the voluntary administration process. But essentially, when the directors sign on the line, they basically sign off that the company is insolvent or likely to become insolvent, and they hand their business and their company across to the voluntary administrator. So as I said, the voluntary administrator then takes control of the company's assets and its business, and then goes about trading it if it's viable. So can you continue those operations, continue to service those contracts that are there to maximize the prospects of potentially the company continuing in existence. So obviously, as part of that, they have to get across all the cash flow. They have to get across what contracts are sitting there and whatnot. So that early engagement and that, as you talked to, Rich, that little bit of pre-appointment work around understanding what the structure is, what the contracts the company's working on, where their major suppliers are, who their major secured creditor are. It's all very important so that the administrator can hit the ground running, make sure there's very minimal hiccups in terms of business continuity and operations. And then once they've sort of taken that initial week to understand where the business is flowing and making sure that it's running smoothly, they can then start to engage with the director or potentially a third party regarding formulating a DOCA proposal or a deed of company arrangement proposal. So I know we've brought up deeds of company arrangement a fair bit already, but I suppose I'll touch on it very briefly just here that it's...
Do that, please.
It's basically, it's a very broad power that's available under the Corporations Act. And it's essentially a contract between the administrators, the company and the creditors. So you can loop in all sorts of different things. There's a handful of requirements that must be met, and I can talk to those later. But essentially, the administrator will be working with those parties to sort of put in place an outcome, which may be a lump sum contribution or payments from trading over time down the track that will likely be a better return than a liquidation. And when I say better return, it doesn't always necessarily mean a cents in the dollar, a better cents in a dollar return. Sometimes it can be more certainty in an outcome or a quicker return. So I suppose that's the process through. The administrator would jump in, continue to trade the business if it's viable, then work together with those parties to formulate a proposal to be presented to creditors. The administrator will provide their opinion on that proposal, as well as the liquidation scenario in terms of what recoveries might be available in a liquidation scenario. That'll all be detailed in the administrator's major report. And then the creditors will meet at the major meeting and decide on the future of the company. And I suppose going back to that early approach, there's a few things that the accountants should keep an eye out for when they may suspect that a client might be in financial difficulty or experiencing some concerns. And Rich, I'm sure you've seen these things plenty of times. And it's never a single aspect of it. A lot of times it's multiple factors that begin to stack up that suggest that a company's experiencing financial difficulty. And I'm thinking things like, creditors pay unpaid outside trading terms, solicitors' letters of demand, financiers sending letters and potentially not extending finance. I'm sure you can talk to plenty of examples like that, Rich.
Yeah, sure. And that comes back to this early, perhaps it's late intervention in the life cycle of the company, but it's early intervention in the insolvency hierarchy. I think there's just a couple of things that I want to jump on from what you were talking about there and just bring those to closer attention. One is that there are actually two meetings of creditors, and Aaron's referred to the major meeting of creditors, but there is actually a first meeting of creditors. And at that meeting, all of the creditors are able to come together and vote on a couple of things. And one of those things is whether or not to retain the incumbent administrator. Now, that's a very important aspect from us as administrators, that if we are going to take an appointment as an administrator from day one, then by the time we get to that first meeting of creditors, we want to reasonably able to have a good chance of retaining our position. And when I say a good chance, a 100% chance of retaining the position is a good start for us. But inevitably, that doesn't always work out that way. So one of the first things pre-appointment is that we're looking at from a risk point of view is whether or not we're going to be able to retain the administration at that first meeting of creditors. The other thing is, and I don't think this has been made clear in any of our discussions about voluntary administration, either in this meeting or the previous meetings, but it's actually the administrator who puts his own wallet on the table to cover all of the costs relating to the administration. So it's a very high risk. And the only indemnity that he has for that at the start of the administration, legally speaking, is the assets of the company itself. So if the administrator gets in there and he makes an assessment on the trading viability of the business, and he's got a different situation to the directors, it's because he's actually got full access to the assets, but so it's slightly different. But on the day he walks in there, he needs to be able to make an assessment about whether or not this thing's going to be able to continue to trade using the assets that it's got. Because if he can't trade it, there's no way that he's going to put his wallet on the table to cover those costs. So one of the other things pre-appointment is that the accountant and the director need to be thinking about, well, once we get into this voluntary administration, is the administrator going to have enough money to be able to trade it through? And by the way, the outcome, if the answer is no, and the administrator gets in and he makes an assessment that it can't trade because he can't be certain of his money situation, then the outcome is that the company will immediately cease to operate. There is no other option. So that's an important aspect to think about before you actually make the appointment. Now, just keep in mind also that cash flow and viability are two different things here. Just because a company may not have the cash flow to be able to do what it needs to do in VA, one of the important things about Hall Chadwick, as a distinct from many of our competitors, is that we will actually make money available either through borrowing or through our own resources to be able to put that money on the table to continue to trade the company, knowing that that there is viability there for the voluntary administration. But if there's not, well, we don't have an option. If there's no viability and there's no cash flow ultimately to come out to pay our costs, our trading costs, then there's no position for the company to go forward. Anyway, that's the couple of points I just wanted to make there.
No, brilliant. Just again, little additions like that, which are good, because even in my mind, I'm sure to all our listeners there, it's triggering certain little things, which is really good for just from a knowledge point of view to actually hear all those little things. I'm just going to throw quickly, because it's 12:30. If any of you guys that are listening got any questions, you want to drop them into the Q&A, please do so for Aaron or for Rich. I know my line has been interesting, so apologies for any breaks that have been happening with this Wi-Fi. So throw that in there. But guys, from a parting comments point of view, I know we've covered a fair bit today. You know, we've gone through quite a lot, and it sort of flowed on from our last month as well, which has been fantastic learning. So is there any sort of parting comments that you guys would like to make, especially given your experience and the pre-work that is so important?
Yeah, I think I'll probably stick with the theme that's probably been quite prevalent throughout the whole presentation and the weeks gone past as well, is that early engagement with an insolvency specialist is paramount, because it can lead to potentially solvent restructuring if the business can, or if the company can manage that. But it also allows sufficient time, if the company is going to go through a voluntary administration process, for the potential appointee or the potential administrator to understand what's running around in the background, what the contracts are, what the works are, what sort of costs there will be, so that they can sort of make a decision on where the voluntary administration may proceed through. And then to pull on Richard's point, obviously sufficient funds to continue trading through that 4 to 5 week period it's much easier for an administrator to come into a company which has, let's say, for argument's sake, $200,000 sitting in a bank account than one that's got nothing and wages to pay tomorrow. So sufficient funds there is fantastic. And then I think the other big thing for an administrator is access to timely and accurate financial information. And this is where our trusted advisors on the call are very, very helpful. So that means the administrator is probably going to come knocking on the accountant's door day one of the appointment and saying, I need to know all this information about how the company's been trading, where its cash flows are at, what we're expecting to generate over the next 4 to 5 weeks, and what our costs are going to be. Because as Richard accurately says, if it isn't viable over that 4 to 5 week period, the unfortunate circumstances that the administrator may need to shut it down. So being able to see that overall picture at a very early stage allows proper planning to be implemented.
Well said, Aaron. Anything you want to add?
Yeah, I'll just add to it that I think probably the message that we've been trying to get out over the last couple of meetings as we've been talking about voluntary administration is that the viability and sustainability of a company is known by the accountant in early stages. It doesn't happen. They don't find that out the week before an appointment. They know it months before. And they know that the difficulty with a client coming to terms with that, it's a hard call for a director to recognise that, look, there is no future for the business without some sort of intervention, and that's a hard call for a director, and an accountant really has to counsel the director through that. The thing that a firm like ours is able to offer is that the support for the accountant in being able to provide the special knowledge, like the specialist knowledge, if I could use that term, the specialist knowledge to a client, to let them understand that, look, this is going to be hard, but we can work out a way through it. I think that's what we can really offer, just to be alongside the accountant and say, well, look, client, you need to have a look at this, because if you don't, the chances of getting through it become even more slim. But you know, together we're able to work out a way to get through it. I think that's what we're able to offer as professional insolvency advisors, to sit alongside the accountants, and we do it with lawyers as well, but sit alongside the accountancy advisors and just help a client understand what their options might be.
I think that's a great point, Rich, and it's probably something that early engagement does lead to, because if you are interacting with a qualified professional early on enough, you're generally going to have the support of creditors, and the big thing there is that, again, the outcome of a voluntary administration does come down to a creditor's vote. So, you know, you might have a circumstance where director or directors put their head in the sand and don't pay accounts for months and months, and that's obviously going to frustrate creditors. Whereas if you can put something in place or engage with the insolvency practitioner early so that there isn't months and months of arrears stacking up, then they're more likely to want to engage with you and support you through that voluntary administration process. And I suppose just while I'm talking on that point, the other big thing that accountants can assist with is making sure that the company is up to date with its ATO compliance, because a lot of the time the ATO may be a substantial creditor in a voluntary administration, and their vote can be sometimes the deciding factor. And we tend to find that they are much more supportive of those companies that continue to lodge or continue to comply with their taxation obligations, even in circumstances where it means that the debt is greatly increased.
Guys, just a brilliant layer of advice, comments, thoughts. And I think to all of you guys that are listening to this, just again, the next layer of ability to say, how do I bring in someone with that level of expertise? And the great part is, as we've had with all our professional partner, our network, is we've got firms everywhere. And while we've got firms everywhere, we've got our offices and our specialists everywhere as well, whether sort of Aaron's in Perth or Rich is in Queensland and the Gold Coast. And so that's the thing that we offer as well. So if you are in that situation and you know that early engagement, please reach out to us, as I know a number of firms have already done that, which is fantastic. Gents, it looks like there's no questions. If you've got anything, throw it in there, please. We're probably going to wrap up in the next couple of minutes. So to all of you that have joined us, thank you very, very much. To Aaron, to Rich, it's a bit like the old Brady bunch, isn't it? Yeah. To you guys, thank you very much for joining us today and giving us your time to share with everyone that's online. Just again, a little bit more to feed a little bit more information to the partners, but to the team members as well, because that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to, again, that further education to a number of team members that may not know this information. So we certainly appreciate both Aaron and Richard both joining us today. No questions. Just quickly before wrapping up, I've got a show tomorrow. Is it tomorrow? I don't even know what day of the week it is. No, it is. It's Tuesday today. On Thursday, I've got my Women in Accounting show with Melissa David. If you haven't registered yet, please jump online and register. We're talking about some fantastic things with Mel, because Mel's very experienced in working with a lot of accounting firms. So from a marketing point of view, from an internal growth to an external growth, she's going to talk about the importance of public speaking, the importance of trying to hold a meeting with team members. How do you do all those things? And as leaders or leaders that are coming through, that may not be education or training or development that you would normally do. So hope you can join us. That's on Thursday at 12 p.m. Eastern Daylight Saving Time, because now we're on Daylight Saving for Melbourne. I will be leaving Canberra tomorrow, heading to the Gold Coast and then back to Melbourne. So questions, nothing there. To all of you that have joined us, thank you very much for joining us. Again, to Rich and Aaron, thanks again, gents. Really appreciate your time, your thoughts, your comments, your advice. And until we talk to you next time, we'll see you then.